herself or itself through us.
Nothing is absolute. I guess that's an absolute statement in itself, but
there are so many religions out there, so many people that have claimed to be the Son of God before Christianity. It's a historical accident.
Buddha taught the same sort of thing. So did Confucius, so did Mohammed. They all teach pretty much the same stuff.
Can we really say what's right and what's wrong?
There are a lot of different religions, a lot of different pathways that people
this
take to God.
This business of Jesus died for your sins. Well, I don't believe that.
Maybe we are all attuned to a frequency that vibrates through the universe that is what we've determined to be God. It's just something that's there.
When RZIM first began, even though I envisioned this ministry meeting a particular need, I never envisioned it growing in such large proportion. While cultures will take shifts and changes, the questions will never change. It is how those questions are articulated, and more importantly, how those answers come across in the culture.
Is God the causative agent of natural disasters?
Are our souls between male and female different?
How do you think Christianity can fix the world?
A lot of the people haven't even heard of Jesus Christ.
How do you find an answer?
The issue of homosexuality in our culture.
I feel it is just to go to war.
How do you prove that?
You stand in front of audiences and they say, here's the dartboard, bring in the darts. I think there's a lot of truth in what you're saying, but you're forgetting an awful lot too.
This is the Walt Disney theology of all dogs go to heaven.
In the West, there has been a massive undermining of the scriptures.
We take the initiative out of the hands of the New Ager.
When it says that faith is a gift in the Bible, that is not the gift of stupidity.
We seek the mind and heart of a generation to find its connection in the person of Christ. When he tells you to let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, that I think ought to be the pursuit of this ministry. I don't know what this is supposed to mean, whether I'm in the fog and you're in the clear, or whether we better remain in the fog after the evening is over. Steve came to me a few moments ago and said my wife Margie already in one sentence had used the word cool twice. So I think I'm getting a younger wife before this evening is over. I want to thank you for coming, because when this was first suggested by my colleagues, I phrased the question, who's going to come? And they assured me that somebody would. So I'm really glad that you're here and you're joining us for this evening. I've just come back about a week ago from a huge international trip. We began in Germany for a week with my colleague Stuart. He and his wife Mary, and Margie and I were together. And our son Nate was with us too. We were doing some research on a forthcoming book, Jesus Talks to Hitler. So we were visiting sites like Munich and Linz and Berlin and Nuremberg, and all those places. Just fascinating to be there. From there I went on to Indonesia, India, and Thailand, and just returned a few days ago. When this evening was first planned, the purpose was very clear. Can we have a setting in Atlanta on a regular basis where we get the opportunity to present a challenge both to one who is sympathetic and to one who is unsympathetic to the Christian faith? So that you may be here as a skeptic, you may be here as a questioner, you even may have a hostile response to what I have to say, and that's all right. I'm quite comfortable in surroundings like that. In fact, if you have any counter perspective or a question you want to raise in challenging what I've said, then this evening is for somebody like you. And we hope we can do this on a regular basis. The challenge, of course, is to decide on a subject where we can keep the parameters clear and at the same time respond to issues of relevance in our time. I am known for giving convoluted titles, so I avoided that, but the theme is still a bit confusing. I have entitled my talk tonight, Questionable Answers. Questionable Answers. How the skeptic's answers still point to the person of Jesus Christ. In the answers they give to us to life's most foundational questions, there is a smuggled in pointer that turns to Jesus Christ as the very answer that they are giving in response to their own questions. Let me begin by reading for you. Some of you may be familiar with this, but since the subject is heavy, this provides a couple of lighter moments of introduction. It talks about this countryish character who was looking for a pastorate and was self-taught at home theologically and was called in by the denominational heads to be interviewed for his religious knowledge. And one of the early questions the bishop asked him was, he said, "Sam, can you tell me the story of the Good Samaritan?" And so his answer went thus, "Yes, sir, I will, sir. Once there was this man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, and he fell among thorns, and the thorns sprung up and choked him. And as he went on, he didn't have no money. And he met the Queen of Sheba, and she gave him 1,000 talents of gold and 1,000 changes of raiment. And he got into a chariot and drove furiously. When he was driving under a big juniper tree, his hair caught on the limb of that tree, and he hung there many days, and the ravens brought him food to eat and water to drink, and he ate 5,000 loaves of bread and 2 fishes. One night when he was hanging there asleep, his wife Delilah came along and cut off his hair. And he dropped and fell on stony ground. But he got up and went on, and it began to rain. And it rained 40 days and 40 nights. And he had hid himself in a cave, and he lived on locusts and wild honey. Then he went on till he met a servant to say, "Come take supper at my house." And he made excuse and said, "No, I won't. I married a wife. I can't go." And the servant went out in the highways and in the hedges and compelled him to come in. After supper, he went on and came down onto Jericho. When he got there, he looked up and saw that old Queen Jezebel sitting down way up high in a window. And she laughed at him and say to him, "Throw her down out there, throw her down." And they threw her down, and he said, "Throw her down again." And they threw her down 70 times 7. And of the fragments that remained, they picked up 12 baskets full, besides women and children. And they said, "Blessed are the peacemakers," P-I-E-C-E. Blessed are the peacemakers. Now, whose wife do you think she will be on that judgment day? You almost have to know the Bible extremely well to have manufactured this fabrication. Tremendous answer. An awful lot of stories in there, but it failed to answer the question. One of my favorite writers, F.W. Borum, the Englishman who lived in Australia and New Zealand for most of his ministry, tells of the time during his school days when he found geography to be utterly uninspiring. And in that, I think he would have a lot of kinship. But he says the reason it was uninspiring to him was the moment he would hear the description of some faraway land, his mind would begin to wander and entertain what this looked like and conjure up images of him visiting there. And on one occasion, the geography teacher was talking about Midwestern Canada. And Borum just began to dream away, going to see the Rockies, taking a train journey, maybe going to a rodeo and all the way to the west and seeing the mountains in British Columbia. In the midst of that daydreaming, the teacher had switched the subject and saw Borum's eyes wandering and asked him the question, "Where am I talking about?" And Borum, of course, had lost him by this point, not knowing what to say, and his classmate sitting next to him just wrote down Java. So Borum just looked at that and he said, "The answer, sir, is Java." He said, "That is right. Now will you tell me what the question was?" I remember studying philosophy at graduate school with one of the brightest minds, a man who had 8 degrees, 3 of them being doctorates. And 50% of his course he reserved not for the answers we gave him in class, but for the questions we raised of him. He said, "By the cogency and the coherence of your questions, I will be able to tell how much you really know about the subject on hand." And sometimes the questions become more important than the very answers we seek to give. They are both critical, and there must be a germ connection between the two. What I want to do tonight, ladies and gentlemen, as best as I can, is look at the answers to 4 themes that society is constantly wrestling with, particularly the skeptic, constantly wrestling with, and how in their answers I see that those answers are in many ways hinting in the direction that a Christian himself would have to give, except they are giving it from a secular worldview. And what I want to do is look at 4 answers that they give. Listen to me very carefully now. 4 answers that they give to which only the question that justifies them is the one that also legitimizes why Jesus Christ is the only way. 4 answers they give to which the only question that legitimizes these answers is also the question that has implicit in it why Jesus Christ is the only way to God. And when you examine these, you'll begin to see what I'm really driving at. You almost have to wait till the last 5 to 10 minutes of the presentation to see how this thing actually comes together. The first is the reality and the mystery of evil. The reality and the mystery of evil. Just a month or so ago, in the New York Times of all places, there was a lead article and it said this: for the worst of us, the diagnosis may be evil. Here's what the writer says: predatory killers often do far more than commit murder. Some have lured their victims into homemade chambers for prolonged torture. Others have exotic tastes for vivisection, sexual humiliation, burning. Many perform their grisly rituals as much for pleasure for themselves as for any other reason. Among themselves, a few forensic scientists have taken to thinking of these people as not merely disturbed, but actually evil. Evil in that deliberate, habitual savagery, and defies any psychological attempt at explanation or attempt at treatment. Most psychiatrists assiduously avoid this word evil, contending that its use would precipitate a dangerous slide from clinical to moral judgment that could put people on death row unnecessarily and obscure the understanding of violent criminals. But many career forensic examiners now say that their work forces them to reflect on the concept of evil, and some actually acknowledge that they can find no other term for certain individuals they have evaluated. In an effort to standardize what makes a crime particularly heinous, a group at New York University has now been developing what it calls a depravity scale, which rates the horror of an act by the sum of its grim details. And a prominent personality expert at Columbia University has published a 22-level hierarchy of evil behavior derived from detailed biographies of more than 500 violent victims. We are talking about people who commit breathtaking acts, who do so repeatedly, who know what they are doing, and who are doing it in peacetime under no threat to themselves, said Dr. Michael Stone, the Columbia psychiatrist, who's examined several hundred killers at Mid-Hudson Psychiatric Center in New Hampton, New York, and others at Creedmoor Psychiatric Center in Queens, where he consults and teaches. We know from experience who these people are and how they behave, and it is about time, he said, that we give their behavior the proper appellation. And it goes on, debating with other scholars. When Ronald Reagan, during his presidency, referred to the Soviet Union as that evil empire, and then looked into the eye of the camera and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, pull that wall down. Pull that wall down," he was intimating at an ideology that had extracted the lives of millions of people, both in its home territory and outside. Just a few weeks ago, as I said, my colleagues and I were in Berlin. And as we were walking in where that checkpoint Charlie once stood, separating east from west, where the wall no longer stands, You can see memorabilia. You can buy books. But unfortunately, people tend to forget that that wall was just in the recent past history. Prior to that, when you examine all that had gone on in Germany and all that the Berliners had been subjected to, you begin to actually see how that hell may well have been in session, and evil was the only description you could give to what had gone on. I was reading the journals of several men and women trapped during the rulership of the Third Reich. Look at here the words of Rudolf Höss, who was also the commandant at Auschwitz, which I visited years ago. And Rudolf Höss, in writing his own journal, describes himself as a family man who went back every night to be with his wife and his children, and he didn't see anything basically bizarre about what he was about and what he was doing, though he was exterminating human beings at the rate of 10 to 12,000 every day in the gas ovens. Listen to his description at the first time he saw the gassing of men and women, and it was Soviet soldiers at that time. Listen to this callousness with which he words his own sentiments. I was not properly conscious of the first gassing of human beings. Perhaps the procedure as a whole made too much of an impression on me. I remember much better the gassing of 900 Russians soon afterwards in the old crematorium, since using Block 11 would have caused too much trouble. While they were still being unloaded, several holes were simply knocked through the earth and cement ceiling of the morgue. The Russians had to undress in the outer room, and they all went quite calmly into the morgue, since they had been told they were to be deloused there. The whole transport walked right into the morgue. The door was locked, and the gas poured in through the openings. How long the killing took, I really do not know. The hum could still be heard for quite a while, however. When it was thrown in, some people cried and screamed gas, and a great roaring began, and a rush to both of the sealed doors. They withstood the pressure, however. After several hours, the room was opened and aired out. Then I saw the gassed corpses en masse for the first time. But I must be frank, this gas had a calming effect on me, since the mass extermination of the Jews was about to begin, and neither Eichmann nor myself knew what method of killing might be used on the expected masses. Now we had discovered the gas and the procedure as well. Just like that. We locked 900 men and women in, sealed the doors, opened the vents, heard the screams, the doors were locked. When they were opened, I saw the corpses. It prepared me for what I was going to do for hundreds of thousands, indeed millions more. I was reading one just this morning from a 17-year-old German soldier, a man who was, his name is Helmut Altner, who was a conscript in the army and happened to be there in the last stand in April almost 60 years ago to this very day. And he was going through the streets with his comrades, knowing that minutes were lying ahead and it would all be over. Listen to a 17-year-old writing. We're on the great road to Berlin. The inhabitants stand outside their doors. They shrink back as our steps echo loudly off the walls of the houses. Then they breathe again with satisfaction because we are Germans. Time is pushing on, inexorably towards the final hour. Women are pressing in from the south. Men hurry across the road, glancing around timidly. SS patrols drive their cars through the streets, stopping a man here, picking up a man there. The car drives off, motors singing. Members of the People Reserve, mainly in SS uniform, close the anti-tank obstacles. Hitler Youth walk the streets proudly with anti-tank grenade launchers. On our right is a large square ringed by the facades of bombed-out houses. 2 SA men in uniform stand by a lamppost. A civilian is hanging bound to a post. There is a red electric cable around his neck, which has bitten deeply into his flesh. His face is blue. His eyes are sunken in the sockets. Around his neck hangs a white cardboard sign saying, "I am Otto Mayer. I was too cowardly to fight for my wife and my child. That is why I am hanging here. I am a rat." I feel a choking sensation inside me as I see this. I would like to look away, and yet I cannot take my eyes off this terrible spectacle. The SA men are laughing and smoking. The dead man swings quietly in the wind. A civilian walking alongside explains in a low voice why this soldier was hanged. He came back just like us, exhausted and war-weary. He escaped the raging battle of extermination and encirclement before the gates of Berlin. He was so young. His wife begged him to stay, and he gave in. Neighbors betrayed him. The SS picked him up. Before the eyes of his horrified wife, before the eyes of his child, he was brutally murdered. First, though, he had to write the shameful sign with his own hands. The SS dictated the text, grinning. Then they strung him up, the wires cut into his neck, and soon killed him. His wife lay unconscious on the ground. The SS drove away. The SA men took over. Journal after journal after journal. This kind of brutality, this kind of mass killing. What do we call this? How do we escape the obvious when we see such horrific acts that remind us human beings have committed slaughter for all kinds of reasons? You know, interestingly, from Germany, I went on to India, as I said, and then into Thailand. While I was in Thailand, actually, on that morning, I just left Indonesia, and that morning, another massive earthquake struck. You may have remembered reading it. And they were afraid of another tsunami warning that was given with the tides that they thought would swell up once again, and tens of thousands could be lost. I was in Bangkok. Phuket is where the resort was that was hit the last time. So all of the hotel managers had to evacuate their guests and left a lot of money. Lost a lot of money. In the Bangkok Post the next day, when the tsunami didn't arrive, was this interview with men and women who were strippers in these resorts. I won't take the time to read it to you, but basically what it says is this, that these strippers have a particular name given to them. And these men and women were utterly infuriated at the management for a false alarm, because most of them now lost their livelihood. All of those who complained for one reason. I want you to hear me now. This is a fact in the land happening to large numbers of young men. They have found out that the way they can make their money is by a sex change operation that costs $10,000. There are thousands of them performing in these resorts to earn money so that they can effectively actually have the sex change operation done and earn money as a woman dancer somewhere. The words go something like this. It's a dream to become a woman, but my income dropped after the tsunami because the tourists fell away. I don't know what else to do, and I love this job. Suki, who is saving for a sex change operation, does not know if it'll be good for his career, but it's his dream to become a woman. Dam, a 30-year-old man who has undergone a sex change, said his income from tips was so meager that his colleagues would probably have to wait a long time before they raised money for the operation themselves. On Monday night, I didn't run like the others, said one. I was sound asleep. If the tsunami had struck, I would be in a real bad shape. So these men, bemoaning a false alarm because it kept them from 1 or 2 days of tips in order to transform the body to look like that of a woman and market themselves in the arena of the sex trade. What do you say to things like this? How do you react? So whether it's violence or sensuality, and then you come over to the United States. It was that very week in Bangkok, all over the news was plastered the tragic shooting that took place in Minnesota at the hands of a young man. And you look around our society and you see things like this happening. What I want to say is this, ladies and gentlemen, whether it's violence or sensuality or brutality or whatever it is, we have to take a step back and ask ourselves the question, who are we and what is the locus of evil? Who are we as a people? In this brilliant book that Os Guinness has just written called Unspeakable, he gives us a very fascinating account. He gives us a fascinating account of what was happening a decade ago in Rwanda, where hundreds of thousands, I think 800,000 or 1 million men and women lost their lives in the slaughter at that time. One world leader, whom I shall leave unnamed, arrived there, landed, left his plane engines running, and spent 2 hours at the airport talking to the NATO forces and talked to the NATO general who happened to be Canadian. And just before he took off, he looked at the NATO general and said to him, "I'm really sorry. I didn't know it was this bad." And the NATO general responded after this world leader left, and he says this. He says, "Didn't know? He didn't know?" He says, "I've spent my life in NATO, and I know what NATO planes overhead knew. Now I am haunted by dreams by the eyes of thousands and thousands of Africans disembodied, dismembered, staring out of the African darkness." Listen to what he says now. You cannot just walk away from something like that saying, you didn't know and you did what you could. You can't just Pontius Pilate 800,000 people. First point I want to make to you is this. No, it's not Rudolf Hess. No, it's not the Nazis. No, it's not the Russian soldiers who came there in the slaughter. It's reflective of all of us. We're all in this together. And as the Allied forces knew what was happening in the slaughter of millions and millions of people, and world leaders were really in some ways handcuffed or in other ways not even dealing with it, the whole world was implicated. And so the first thing we need to bear in mind is, it is not that the evil is there done by somebody else. All of humanity shares this. We cannot Pontius Pilate a mass of humanity and say others are doing it. But the second point I want to make is this, and this is very critical in the body of what I'm trying to say to you. When we are talking about evil, Guinness lists a whole host of humanistic writers who basically make this pronouncement in one way or the other. Listen, for example, Virgil in his Aeneid. What region of the earth is not full of our calamities? Thomas Hobbes in De Homine. Man is the most cunning, the strongest, and the most dangerous animal. Voltaire, after the 1755 Lisbon earthquake, where tens of thousands died, writes to a pastor, "I pity the Portuguese like you, but men still do more harm to each other on their little molehill than nature does to them. Our wars massacre more men than are swallowed up by our earthquakes." The skeptic David Hume in his dialogues concerning natural religion, "Man is the greatest enemy of man." Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the humanist in Emile, "Seek the author of evil no longer, it is yourself." And here's what I want to say to you. If these are humanists talking, and the answer then is that humanity itself is wrong, what is the question? The question is, where is evil located? It's located in your heart and mine. Where is evil located? And ladies and gentlemen, if that is true, can you really deal with the humanistic agenda without first recognizing what the problem is with humanity? And so I phrase my question to the first answer this way. Can you talk of evil without assuming a moral framework? And can you talk of educating society without first looking inside the human heart? Can you talk of evil without assuming a moral framework? And can you talk of educating a society without first looking inside the human heart? Have you looked into your own heart lately? And as I travel and as I see and as I read, I know how easy it is for you and I to fall victims to the same thing. No, we may not go the route of a man somewhere in Phuket who wants to spend $10,000 changing his body so he can market himself, but we too have a price tag and sell our convictions for other reasons. Until you've seen your own heart, you will never be able to, with the humanist, talk about evil and let it just hang there in isolation. You have to anchor it in some way. So my first question is this: can you talk of evil without assuming a moral framework? Can you talk of educating humanity without first looking inside the human heart? The second is this. First is the reality and mystery of evil. The second is the quest for human justice. How we long and long and long for human justice. You know, one of my colleague staff members gave me a little quip the other day by Tim Allen, the comedian. He was standing in front of an audience and he said, I want you to know I really feel safe now. I really feel safe now. So now that we've taken Martha Stewart and put her behind bars, I really feel safe walking around now. He said, yeah, OJ and Kobe are still innocent. Osama bin Laden and Zarqawi are still on the loose. He said, but the only woman in America who was willing to cook and do laundry, we've hauled away and put her behind bars. This is our judicial system. I'm not saying rightly or wrongly. I do not know what the issue was. All I'm just saying to you is, have you ever seen, pardon me if you're an attorney, please forgive me for this, but have you ever seen two attorneys on a show arguing from different perspectives and both claiming the law is on their side? And then you see wizards with words. And even if one is right, they're both made to look bad because the counterpoint is made with the same degree of eloquence as the point is being made. And by the time you finish, you actually walk away thinking that the accused is more innocent than the accuser. And somehow this poor accused is now the victim for what he or she is now charged with doing. Years ago, a book was written called The Insanity Plea, and one of the cases given was that of Hinckley in his attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan. And the man writing the book said, we are going to be faced, and we are now, he said, faced with a strange situation. He said the man prosecuting him saying he was guilty and should be incarcerated. The man defending him said he was actually insane and ought to be exonerated. And finally, when he was put away, he said the time is going to come where the man who was trying to prosecute him is going to say he is actually insane and ought to be kept in there. And the man who was defending him is going to say he's not insane, now he has to be released. That's exactly what happened. And at the end of it, you wonder who's insane. Whether it's the man who's being tried, or whether it was our very judicial system. Some years ago, I read these words by a 14-year-old in Bosnia. Here's what he said. So many people have been killed fighting for justice. But what justice? Do they really know what they're fighting for? The weather is growing colder now. No longer can you hear the singing of birds, only the sound of children crying for a lost mother, or father, or brother, or sister. We are all now the children without a country and without hope. What justice? What justice do you see in courts today that makes you think we have keepers of the law who truly understand what moral guilt is all about? Centuries ago, Aristotle said these profound words. Hear me carefully, please. Justice alone of all the virtues is thought to be for another's good, because it is related to our neighbor, for it does what is advantageous to another. Now the worst man is he who exercises his wickedness both towards himself and towards his friends. And the best man is not he who exercises virtue towards himself, but he who exercises it towards another. For this is a difficult task. Justice in this sense then is not a part of virtue, but virtue entire. Nor is the contrary injustice a part of vice, but vice entire. You see what Aristotle is saying? In his estimation, he thinks justice is not a part of virtue, but it is the heart of virtue. And injustice is not just on the fringe of being evil. He said it is at the heart of all evil. That's why he said justice is the firmest pillar of good government. Justice is the firmest pillar of good government. When the Lord looked down at his messenger Micah, he says, what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love mercy and to walk humbly before the Lord? What God is saying is justice is that pristine virtue which a society is called upon to display and which you and I as individuals must always have. I remember when I was a young student at university in Delhi, we sat on stools and didn't even have a desk in front of us. We used to have our notepads on our laps and we'd be writing. And I think at that time I was a pre-med student or something like that. And there was a class full and the professor was lecturing. And just then one student was asked to answer a question, as was customary. When the professor asked you to answer a question, you stood up. So he stood up and started to answer. There was a real renegade guy sitting next to me, and gradually he used his foot to pull the stool back so that when the student was going to sit down, he'd come crashing down onto the floor. In the last moment, I saw that the stool had been pushed back, and I reached out to push it into the right place just too late as the student sat down and he came crashing onto the floor. And the professor saw my hands on the stool and just looked at me and said, "Zacharias, get out." I said, "But sir," he said, "get out." I folded my books, walked out of there. Till this day, that irks me. It bothers me. Not so much at the fellow who pulled the stool away. He was an idiot. But at the professor who wouldn't even give me a chance to explain what actually happened. In this grand cosmic scheme of things, it has not affected anything except me. That little act of injustice bothered me. What do you think happens in a world where crime is rife, where rapes, murders, abuse, injustices take place? How it must break the pure heart of God that we have violated so much, and all we have as a response is one injustice piled after another. When Robert Shapiro was asked by Larry King on his night program what actually happened that night then if O.J. Simpson was exonerated from that, Robert Shapiro gave an incredible answer. When Larry King said, "What is true about that night then?" Shapiro said, "Larry, we don't deal with questions of truth in law." He said, "I make professional judgments. I do not make moral judgments." And as I sat there listening, would he have said that if that were his daughter? Would he be content if he were on the receiving end of that kind of a strangulation and saying, "I just make professional judgments, I don't make moral judgments"? You see again and again and again this cry for justice, the cry for justice. Look at what has happened in the victimization of millions of people across our globe. You know, I hail from a part of the world that is quite deprived monetarily. And every time I go there, I find myself in some settlement of the impoverished. I'll walk into the homes of some people who live with very little. I never hesitate to walk into some of those slums, and you see in a different kind of fashion, injustice upon injustice upon injustice. It's piled one upon the other. I want to position this in contradistinction to a man I knew, known to many of my staff, known to many of you who have attended some of our events. Many of you may remember a very noble man by the name of Brent McKnight, who came from South Carolina. He was a federal judge and actually was being tapped on his way one day to possibly being a Supreme Court nominee. He's a brilliant man, a gracious man, one of the nicest human beings I have ever known, or we at RZIM have ever known. He came and spoke to our audience once about law and justice, a decent, honorable man. And I remember on one occasion as Margie and I were having a meal with him and his wife, I said, "Brent, what is the most difficult part about being a judge?" He said, "I'll never forget the occasions where I've had to come down and make a judgment call on somebody and knowing what the law said and knowing what the truth was about the case. And as I have made the pronouncement and knowing it is going to cost somebody years behind bars or somebody an awful lot in many ways," he said, "Ravi, I've actually gone back into my chambers and buried my face in my hands and wept uncontrollably at having to play the part of a judge." Just 3 or 4 months ago, in his early 50s, he was suddenly stricken with cancer and within weeks lost his life. But I think of the judge like him who recognizes there's a law to be honored, and yet there's a broken heart in the process that somebody is going to have to pay, and he goes back into his private chambers and weeps. That's the kind of judge you respect. That's the kind of judge you honor. And so here's my second question for the skeptic who talks for justice. It is this: you cannot cry for justice unless you can also know the justifiable source for all law. You cannot cry for justice unless you can also know the justifiable source for all law. First thing, Can you talk of evil without assuming a moral framework? Can you talk of education without first looking inside the human heart? Second question, you cannot cry for justice unless you know the justifiable source for all moral law. While we were in Nuremberg, we found ourselves in courtroom 600, where the trials were actually held. And you see the furnishings. You almost wish that furniture could talk and the walls could talk. I had Stuart with me because he's an expert on the Second World War history, and really was our guide through this week, gave us an incredible amount of information. He's got an encyclopedic mind in all of this. But it happened to be sort of this probing, boundaryless existence of my wife's architectural interest that got us in there. We were trying to find a parking spot and we lost her. She was vanished. And I said, here am I in Nuremberg and I don't know where my wife is. And so we are looking all over the place. Our son is looking, we're looking, all searching. All of a sudden she comes out of a building and says, come on, hurry. Well, to our utter shock and horror, we were in the building and she took us into the room. We didn't ask too many questions. We just got ourselves in there. If you've seen the movie Judgment at Nuremberg or the Nuremberg trials, you've seen that very furniture and seen it going on. But as we walked in, I noticed two pictures. First is above the door as you walk in. It's the picture of the serpent tempting Adam and Eve. And above the tribunal are the Ten Commandments. Isn't that interesting? You will be as gods, is what Satan said, defining good and evil. And when they ate of that fruit, the slippery slope was entered into. And then the moral law was given. And what happened at Nuremberg? The justice, the American justice, trying to bring evidence after evidence after evidence. And every Nazi officer said we were operating according to the law of our own land. We were operating according to the law of our own land. Till finally the justice cries out, but gentlemen, is there not a law above our laws? And so, ladies and gentlemen, here's my question for you. You cannot really cry for justice, can you? Unless you know the justifiable source for all moral law. There is a third. First, the reality and mystery of evil. Secondly, the cry for justice. Thirdly is this hunger for this thing we call love. It is the theme of a poet. It is the theme of a philosopher. It is the theme of a musician. It is the theme of artists. It is the theme of our movies. Romance, romance, romance. We pine for it. We long for it. We want to cling to it. It is love that touches the heart in its tenderest moments. Whether it's the love of a mother for a child, or love for a husband for his wife, or wife for her husband, or love for a pitiful person on the street that you pick up and rescue. You notice this thing we call love, which is the great hunger and the longing of the human heart. You know, people give me all kinds of kind remarks and kind accolades. People like yourselves who show up, give you undue respect and so kind, thinking the world of you and all that you do and write and say. And it's wonderful to have all of that. Believe me, the affirmation is very, very helpful. But as I travel and see and enjoy, I still know that the most glorious thing in my heart is to know that I love and I'm loved by my family. Because that's where love narrows down. It narrows down not merely to an epithet. It is not merely an idea. It is not merely paying bills. It's not merely living under a roof. It is a commitment of spirit to live with honor and an uncompromising commitment both in thought and in deed. It is fascinating to me that the Lord of creation called everything he created good. The only thing he said was not good was for man to live alone. And then this Lord, who is infinite in power and multiplied in capacity, finds an instrumental means rather than an ultimate means. He finds an instrumental means by fashioning another entity to be the complement of the one he had created and make this love one for the other. He sort of lifted himself out of being the direct communicator with that and made an instrumental means of meeting this love. Once we get a handle on that, then we understand the trust that God has placed in you and the trust that God has placed in me, that he believes I have the capacity and the strength given by him to honor the commitment that I have made. The world has lost it. We don't understand it anymore. We've picked our own pockets. We've plundered it. Hollywood entertains us, the last body of people on the face of the earth that seem to understand what love is all about. And yet abundant in their maverick productions, knowing absolutely no boundaries about this. You know, during the week of the Super Bowl, with all of the festivities and all that goes on, one night we were watching one of the news programs, and they were interviewing the Iraqi war veterans who were given a unique privilege by these athletes. Some of the wounded who could travel were given a choice of spending one evening in a gathering with one athlete of their choice. And of course, others, entertainment icons and all, got into this, and it was a wonderful gift given to them. Some without arms, some without legs, some heavily wounded, now recovering, were flown into wherever this gathering was and had a wonderful evening. There was this lovely young African-American gal in her uniform, and she was interviewed. She was without her left arm, and here's what she said. She was atop a building where all of a sudden they came under heavy, heavy fire. And while that building was being shelled, she says, before I even knew it, all of a sudden I knew I'd been hit, and my comrades rescued me. I knew my left arm had gone flying, and I was without my left arm from the shoulder. And as they put me onto a stretcher and rushed me down, as they put me into an ambulance, she said, I was screaming, and one of them said, are you in pain? Are you in pain? She said, no, my ring, my wedding ring. I've lost my hand. Against orders, 2 or 3 of the guys jumped out of that vehicle, went back to the roof, found the hand, rescued the ring, and brought it back to her. And she stood there in front of the camera, flashing that wedding ring now in her right hand. And I want to ask you this question. How proud would you have been if you were the husband of that woman, knowing that her greatest agony during that lost moment was not the arm, but the ring? That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the reality of a moral commitment that God invests in you and invests in me. Think of love, the nobility of it, the sacrifice of it, the circumference of it, and yet it has boundaries. It has boundaries. And so my third thing is this. You cannot say the answer is love unless you ask the question of life's intrinsic value. Hear me? You cannot say the answer is love unless you ask the question of life's intrinsic value. So question number 1, you cannot talk of evil without assuming a moral framework and locating it ultimately in the heart of man. Number 2, you cannot cry for justice unless you know the justifiable source for all moral law. Number 3, you cannot say the answer is love unless you ask the question of life's intrinsic value. Wasn't this what the whole issue of Terry Schiavo was all about? Is this a value of intrinsic worth or extrinsic worth? Are we conferring value, or is there intrinsic, essential value to a human being? And as I see it, the mystery and reality of evil, the cry of justice, the hunger for love, and the fourth and the most important thing here is the inescapable dependence on forgiveness. The inescapable dependence on forgiveness. Which of us has not ever needed that? In that one instance where I was accused of pushing away a stool, it's nice to know that you're the innocent one somehow being blamed. Think of the number of times where I ought to have been blamed and really wasn't. We just get away with it. We get away with it. Sometimes in the West, we do not understand this. I well remember in my early days as a believer meeting a young Muslim man in Delhi who had come to know Christ in the recent days that I had just come across him. And I remember him saying he cries and sobs uncontrollably because he thinks of the many ways in which he had grieved God, in which he had offended God, in which he had violated his law. He talked about the heaviness of heart and the repentance, that there was only his hope that God would forgive him because he desperately needed to be forgiven. Some of you heard me tell this story, but I remember some years ago, I think it was in Anaheim, California, when I was at a book signing along with several other authors, and your publishers keep you in their confines and in their stalls, and you're standing there as people come and want their book signed, and my wife was standing next to me, and all of a sudden I looked at the publishing house next door to mine, and I saw a man standing there all alone. And I called Margie over. I said, I think that's Jim Bakker of PTL fame. I remember the days when he used to come to occasions like that, and he and his wife would be sitting on what could only be described as golden thrones. And people would come and just almost pay homage to them, grabbing the hand and kissing the hand and so on. And they sat there. Now, he was a fallen man. He was a disenfranchised man. He was a man with a black mark upon his career. He was literally standing there all alone in front of the bookstall. And that night he spoke, and the crowd listened in riveted attention. His book, of course, is entitled, I Was Wrong. And he said how he remembered the day when he was in prison with his overalls sloshing water all over the place in the bathrooms, cleaning the bathrooms with mop and bucket and all that. When a guard came to him and said, Jim, he said, there's somebody here to see you. You might want to come and say hello. He said, I don't want to meet anybody. He said, no, I think you'd want to meet this man. And he said, looking at himself with all of these watermarks splashed over his overalls, he thought he'd go and change, and then he said, no, I'd better go like this. And wiping away his hands, wondering who had really come to visit him, Jim Bakker tells the story of how he walked into the visitor's lounge, and as he walked there, he was momentarily caught completely off guard, couldn't say a word, as he saw Billy and Ruth Graham standing there in the visiting lounge. And Billy just strode right over to Jim Bakker and wrapped his arms around him, overalls, dirt and all, and just held him in his arms. And Bakker then said, I cried and cried in the arms of a man, realizing I represented all that was untrustworthy in this land. He represented all that could be trusted, and I was wrapped in his arms. The joy of forgiveness. My wife was reminding me of the story of the Scarlet and the Black, a true story of a Catholic priest from the Vatican who was involved in smuggling out Jews to rescue them from the hate of the Nazis. And that movie is, the role is played by the famed Gregory Peck. He does a great job in that as he is in this underground escape route for these Jews. And the Gestapo is on to him, and they tell him if he makes one step outside the Vatican, inside the Vatican, he had diplomatic immunity. One step outside the Vatican and they would get him. So he would come almost to the boundary line and taunt them. But one way or the other, through disguises, he would get out of there, and this underground escape route was held intact. In the last days and hours, as the Nazi regime was coming to an end, one Gestapo officer managed to get to see him, and he said, I have a plea for you. Do me a favor. I know my life is going to come to an end. I'm going to get caught. But I want you to help rescue my wife and my children. And the man looks at him and says, you have audacity? With all that you've killed, with all that you've destroyed, you now want your wife and your children to be rescued in all of this? And he really gives him a verbal tongue lashing. The Gestapo officer looks at him and says, so much for your Christianity then, is it? So much for your grace and all that, and walks away. After the story comes to an end, the Allies are looking across the table at this Gestapo officer and one says to him, how did you get your wife and children out of here? Where are they? He said, I didn't get them out. He said, oh yeah, they've been rescued. How did you do it? And then it dawns on him that the priest had made arrangements to rescue the wife and the children and get them out of there. And in the postscript to the movie it says, while this man was in prison, the priest visited him every day. Till the day of his release, he asked if he could be baptized and know this Christ that the priest was living for. Isn't that what the grace is all about and forgiveness is all about? Ladies and gentlemen, here it is. You cannot talk of reconciliation unless you also ask the question of the atonement and of our alienation. You cannot talk of reconciliation unless you also talk of alienation and the atonement. Number one, you cannot cry evil without a moral framework and the heart of man. Number two, you cannot cry for justice without a justifiable source of moral law. Number three, you cannot answer with love unless you grant the question of intrinsic worth. And number four, you cannot talk of reconciliation unless you ask the question of the atonement and of alienation. And so the naturalist and the humanist talks of evil, talks of justice, talks of love, and talks of forgiveness. With these four answers of evil, justice, love, and forgiveness, only in the understanding of the question, why did Jesus Christ have to die, can we legitimize these other answers. For you see, ladies and gentlemen, there's only one event in the world in which these four converge. It is only on Calvary that you have evil, justice, love, and forgiveness in one act converging, which means the skeptic in the hunger for these four is implicitly pointing to Calvary. There is no other way to justify these four categories. And as I pondered it and I thought, what question would I ask to counter this point? Frankly, I couldn't come up with any. How do you talk about evil without talking about the human heart? How do you talk about justice without talking about an ultimate moral law? How do you talk about love without talking about intrinsic worth? How do you talk about forgiveness without having somebody who pays? You know what? You won't hear too many sermons on forgiveness from an Islamic pulpit. I mean that. You won't hear sermons on forgiveness in Buddha's preaching. You don't hear it in the pantheistic worldview. In karma, you pay, you pay, you pay. In Islam, it's inshallah. The wish of Allah, the wish of God. Only on the cross of Calvary do you have a concrete expression of these four truths. You know, when Mel Gibson said he spent 14 years studying the Passion till he was ready to release it in a movie, he knew what he was pondering about. That grand mystery of a bloodied body, of a battering unthinkable, of a humiliation that till today we are talked about, debate an Islamic scholar, he spews back at me. How can you have a God who is at the mercy of his people? How can you have a Christ as the Son of God, bullied, tortured? Where is his strength? Where is his power? And they question, not seeing the depths of mercy and the depths of love and the depths of power. The famed E. Stanley Jones, who preached for many decades in India, who I had the privilege of hearing in his latter years, used to talk for about 1.5 hours in all of his lectures without a scrap of paper in front of him. His famous books, The Christ of the Round Table, The Christ of the Indian Road. Mahatma Gandhi had a huge impact on E. Stanley Jones had a huge impact on Mahatma Gandhi. And E. Stanley Jones was telling the story of a time an Indian aristocrat came to him and said he understood a lot about the gospel, but he did not understand the death on the cross. Why the cross? Why the cross? Why did Jesus have to die? Until this man had floundered and fallen and stumbled into an adulterous relationship, and his wife was on to him and found out what had happened. It crushed her beyond measure, as it was at least outwardly crushing him. He asked her for forgiveness and said it wouldn't happen again. And even as she wept and wiped away the tears, she accepted his explanation and decided she would just bury this sorrow and let it go. And he told Stanley Jones later, he said, you know, I wondered, how could she have just gotten over it? How could she have just said, We'll bury it. We'll forget it. He said, until one day I came home early from work and I walked into the room and my wife, who is a believer, he said, in Christ, was on her knees crying and crying and crying. Jesus, help me, help me, help me to bury this. Help me to cover this. Will you take this burden of me? And the husband says, as I stood at the door and watched my wife so broken, pleading for the blood of the cross to help her bury it, he said, for the first time I understood what it means when love is crucified by sin. As sin was thrown onto love, and as Jesus answered back, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Do you now understand why Mark has 33% of his entire gospel devoted to the last week of Christ? 1/3 of his entire gospel, the first gospel, is given over to the passion of the Lord. It was something he wanted to explain for people to understand. That's why even Peter the apostle, when Jesus looked at him and asked him 2 questions, he answered them. Question number 1, who do men say that I am? Some say you're Jeremiah, some say you're Elijah, some say you're one of the prophets. Who do you say that I am? You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus says, blessed are you, Simon, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And the Bible says from that moment on, he began to teach them what manner of death he will die. And the scriptures say this, Peter then took Jesus aside and rebuked him, saying, never, Lord, never. This fisherman looked at the Lord and rebuked him. He said, you're not going to die this kind of death, are you? And he said, get thee behind me, Satan. You're not minding the things of God, but you're minding the things of men. Ladies and gentlemen, when Jesus' love, mercy, and forgiveness are talked about, but the cross is evicted in that discussion, we are minding more the ways of the devil of solving it. It is only when the cross is centerpiece can these 4 be explained, and we need to understand why it is that Jesus Christ went to the cross for you, sir, and why he went to the cross for me. It is these truths that you pursue that were embodied on Calvary so that you and I could walk away forgiven with the love of God and understanding the evil heart that lives within us and how a just God paid the price for our forgiveness. Let me bring this to a close. In his Everlasting Man, G.K. Chesterton says this, listen please. Life is a great game of noughts and crosses. The noughts, the circle represents the basic monotony of life. The most eloquent symbol on a pagan temple, says Chesterton, was a serpent with the tail in its mouth, a complete circle. But for the Christian, says Chesterton, you must put the cross inside the knot. The 4 extremes of the cross will pierce the knot. That's 0. When you put the cross inside of it, the 4 extremities pierce and take away the circularity and the redundancy of life and brings in the breath of God and moves you in a direction that he intended for you and to me. May I say that those 4 extremities could well be the nature of evil, the nature of justice, the nature of love, and the nature of forgiveness. When that cross gets into the center of your life and pierces those extremities, then you understand what life is all about. Martin Luther said this, and with this I close. He wrote a letter to a friend. He says, I was lately looking out of my window last night, and I saw the stars in the heavens and God's great beautiful arch over my head. But I could not see any pillars on which the great builder had fixed this arch. And yet the heavens fell not, and the great arch stood firmly. There are some who are always feeling for pillars and longing to touch them, and because they cannot touch them, they stand trembling and fearing lest the heavens should fall. If they could only grasp the pillars, then the heavens would stand fast. May I suggest to you, ladies and gentlemen, there is no place to anchor evil, justice, love, and forgiveness. There is only one structure that holds them together with meaning. That is the cross of Jesus Christ. So my talk to you tonight was called Questionable Answers. How the answers of the skeptic still point to the person of Jesus Christ. When your questions and your answers connect, then life bridges the mind with the heart and frees you to truly live for the purpose that God has created you. If you do not know Jesus Christ tonight, here's my invitation to you. Get back home this evening and get on your knees and do this prayer in a simple way and an honest way. Lord Jesus, if you are who you claim to be, I'm open. Reveal yourself to me. If you've got a Bible, start reading the Gospel of John, and you'll begin to see why he is the way, the truth, and the life. If you already are a follower of Christ, I want to encourage you to probe the depths of this grand master of ours and understand how rich are his truths, how delectable are his mercies, how enthralling is his gospel. There is nothing like it on the face of the earth. The reason I was in Indonesia was for one man, very highly powerful businessman, a Muslim man. Last time I was there, he was talking to me while I was in the car on the way to the airport. And he was challenging the Christian faith with one question after another. I said to him, I'll make you a promise. You give me one morning and ask me any question on the Christian faith. I'll give you one morning and ask you any question on Islam. And I'll promise within a year I'll be back. I kept that commitment on March the 26th. Actually, it happened to be my birthday while I was traveling on to India that day. So he arrives and he spends the whole morning with me. By 12 o'clock at noon, he said, I have to say, I do not have answers to most of these questions. I said, are you willing to pray and ask Jesus to reveal himself to you? He said, yes. So there we were in my hotel room, praying with this man. And as he walked away, I just am waiting for the chance to see him again and find out the miracle of what God has already begun in his life. Will you pray that prayer tonight? Lord Jesus, if you are who you claim to be, reveal yourself to me. And if you know him, plumb the depths of his greatness. For eye has not seen, ear has not heard, neither has entered into the heart of man the things which God has prepared for them that love him. This has been a convoluted message, but you've been a very patient audience. Thank you for listening to me. God bless you. See you.